Welcome everyone to our session today. We look forward to sharing our experiences and to really strengthening all of our understanding around nonprofit dashboards and the role that they play in successful financial management. As always in our webinars, I'd like to start with a few polls to have a sense as to who is in the room with us today. Welcome everyone. And please take a few seconds to answer these polls for us. So the first is a question around your organization's budget. So if you could please take a look at these four options, and Amanda will launch the poll now. Please give us your response as to what your organization's budget is today. And Amanda, as soon as you think we have responses tabulated, please publish the results.
Okay.
Okay, are you ready? Okay. Well, as we can see here, we have a little bit of a bell curve with most organizations being from the 1 to 5 million, and then about 28% over 5 million, and the rest within 250 to 1 and under 250. You could see here, this is a topic of interest to organizations of all sizes. And now I'd like to ask you about your mission area. What are the things that your organization really cares about, and what brings you to the sector? Amanda, if you could launch that. Great, thank you. We did, we think we came up with almost every option. We have 10 options, but if there is something that's not listed here, you do have an other in the chat. Again, Amanda, let us know when we have.
I think we're almost there.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Great. I love these responses. I think what we're seeing here is that we have organizations across the sector in all different areas. And again, I think a testament to the fact that dashboards are a tool for all of us, irrespective of exactly our mission focus in the sector. So thank you so much for that response. Just two more polls. The next poll is around dashboards. And here's where we, the panelists, are really looking forward to learning. Are you looking today at dashboards? Are they helping you make decisions? Do you have them, but maybe they need some updating, or maybe more reviewing? You feel like you could do more? Not yet, but you're in the process of developing. Or no, we don't have them, but hopefully today will open up the possibilities for us. So Amanda, if you could go ahead. Great, thank you. Again, where are your dashboards in your priorities right now?
Okay, we're ready to share.
Great. Okay, so almost half of the participants are not working with a dashboard yet, but they're thinking about developing it. We hope to be helpful for you. And as you can see, we have 18% are really using them. And hopefully you will share with us some of your wisdom through the Q&A as well. Thank you so much. And lastly, for those of you who do share a dashboard, who is it shared with? And Amanda, you can go ahead and launch it. Is it executive leadership? Is it the management team or budget owners, board, or other external stakeholders? Who do you share your dashboard with today? Ready, Amanda? Okay. Again, we may have same dashboard or different dashboard, but you can see that many different stakeholders from within the organization are participating and there are some organizations that are taking it externally. And as we shared today different considerations for dashboards, you will start to think about which ones feel right internally and which ones might feel more appropriate for an external audience. So in terms of our agenda for today, we will be speaking about dashboards and how they connect to understanding our business model. We will talk about KPIs, key performance indicators. If you have not heard that term before, today is a great day to take it with you from the learnings. We'll talk about types of indicators. I'll introduce the concept of leading and lagging indicators, which is a really important concept. We'll talk about team-based decision making, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions with our moderators. We will then dive into conversations with Dawn and Kim, who are practitioners in the field, about how dashboards have really shaped the way that they manage their organizations, and we'll have an opportunity to learn more about their particular dashboards. So what do we mean when we say dashboard? The concept of a dashboard is this concept of stating information in charts, bar graphs, not particularly in numbers and words the way that we're used to. So this is just a sort of a concept of what do we mean when we think of dashboard, what are we measuring? And so when we think about why have a dashboard, if we have our system generated reports, we maybe have some management memos, why would we need a dashboard? We believe that dashboards are really a tool to be strategic, to be able to identify what are those key performance indicators. There is lots of information that leaders need to manage. This is a way of really surfacing what is important. And it's a tool for action. It is a tool for course correction. It is a tool for behaving in a specifically maybe different way based on results. And so as for those of you who do have dashboards or are working on developing them, think about these points and whether they are in fact how you've been developing the concept for a dashboard. So again, we want it to be action oriented and we want it to support decision making, often accompanied by conversation and dialogue. So part of the essence of a dashboard is using it as a tool to bring people together. As far as understanding the business model, in prior webinars, we've talked about the idea of business models being driven by the kinds of revenues that you have. And we're on our 5-part series there. The actual dashboard allows you to think about, well, what are the drivers of revenue? What are the drivers of expense? What are my key contributing drivers for each of these and how would I want to monitor those? And then lastly, with respect to program delivery, what are the statistics, the measures that are critical to understand how do we bring our business together and what remains important? And so to give you an opportunity to think about if I were developing a business model driven KPI metrics and I was running a dashboard, what would I be tracking? So this is a question for you around which revenue model is most critical to your organization. So let's give that some thought. If you were, and Amanda, if you could launch that poll, if you were asking what would be the critical driver of your dashboard, what would it be? Would it be individual revenue, foundation, government? Do you have an earned revenue strategy that is primarily your operating model? Is it a membership organization? What would it be for you and what is it today as you're thinking about the model?
Okay, we can publish now.
Okay, almost a balanced pie chart of the different sources of revenue. And I think the critical conclusion here is which is it for you? And what are the drivers? What are the leading indicators when you are trying to project individual, foundation, government? How do we think about that? And so let me say a little bit more about KPIs. And so successful KPIs have a few characteristics. They go back to measurable business model drivers. So we can identify, we can quantify. They reflect progress towards outcomes. So we have goals and we can measure against those. They are clearly articulated and we can take action based on those results. The KPIs, to be successful in the context of a dashboard, they have the data available. And so if you are starting to build your dashboard and first you have to calculate the data, that's probably a system that isn't ready yet to be generating the dashboard. The data needs to be available to be pulled, not necessarily calculated. And they are created in these actionable, the sort of decision based formats. They're not forever. And often a good time to think of KPIs is during your planning, whether it be strategic planning or annual planning. What are the drivers that are going to be very critical to our success this year? And I mentioned earlier about two different kinds of indicators. We have the leading indicators. Think of these as the indicators that are about predicting the future. They define what we need to do in order for our goals to be reached. And they are dynamic. They can serve as that indicator, but sometimes they're difficult to measure. So I'm going to give you an example in a minute. These are things that if they happen, what we're aiming for will happen. On the other hand, the lagging indicators are really about understanding the past. They let us know where we are based on actual results. They are able to be calculated because events have occurred. They're easy to measure, but often difficult to change because it's looking in the rearview mirror when we're looking at lagging indicators. Whereas when we're looking at leading indicators, we're looking at what is possible to happen in the future. Um, we need both of them. And let me share two examples. So these are examples of KPIs. If we are focused on increasing board donations, we may look at board pledge forms. We may look at board donations themselves. If we're focusing on grants and grants being applied for, we can measure the amount of grants submitted and we can measure the amount of grants that we actually won. So from a leading indicator, looking at the grants as the example, if we are measuring the number of grants that we are submitting, that is a leading indicator. We would like to think that the more grants that we submit, the more chances there are that we will actually win the grants. And so that is something that we are predicting in terms of the possibility of winning. On the grants one side, did we win as many as we thought? And what is the relationship between the two? If you have an attendance-based model, seats occupied by participants, by patrons, by students, that's usually a predictor of revenue. Once we've seen the revenue, that is a lagging indicator. And as far as the past, very difficult to change. Now we may change what we think about in the future. So that's the distinction between the two. And as you think about which KPIs you might want to measure, we want to have both, but definitely want you to focus on what are those leading indicators that might help you predict outcomes before they actually happen. We also, on the concept of a dashboard, we want you to be thinking about the action aspect of it. So here's a very, very simple dashboard. It is available on the website that's noted here, and it is pre-formatted, ready to go. It is a very simple Excel-based dashboard. But the important part that we want to highlight here is the traffic system that we all are very familiar with in our day-to-day lives. And this concept of red, yellow, green, this will come up a little bit later in some of our conversations with our guests. This idea that if you identify certain metrics and you define what is the expectation, that is the target column, when will we know that we're on target? When will we know that we are maybe a little bit off target? And when are we in the red zone? Simply by looking at the red, yellow, green, your stakeholders will understand, are we working as we thought, or are we maybe not meeting plan? The goal here is to focus on the dashboard development around that definition and around how we think about that. Your 5, or in this case 4 KPIs are really unique to each organization. And in thinking about those KPIs, there's also this idea that we want the KPIs to cover lots of different aspects of the organization, but only the ones that are particularly critical to you. So in this other resource that you will see as part of the website materials, the idea is to think about what are the possible KPIs that you might measure for your own organization and what feels right to you. The process of engaging, we'll hear more about how important it is to engage those stakeholders and to have sort of like a beginning cheat sheet of what you might measure for each of these particular areas. So if your fundraising and grants management is key to you, here are some particular indicators to start with. And so these are resources to sort of help think about how to identify which are those KPIs that are important to us in along with all of your planning efforts. And then lastly, I will say that identifying the key stakeholders and the purpose for the dashboard becomes really critical. And so questions to ask in identifying your stakeholders or identifying how to best inform them are questions like, what do they need to know about the business? How will they engage with this dashboard? Will it be on a weekly, monthly? Will it be prior to meetings, prior to decision making? How can this group make the best use of the dashboards to test the assumptions that we've made, to test what we thought were the drivers for the year? And then finally, the dashboards are about action. And therefore, how can these metrics and these tools help us drive this idea of continuous improvement and revisiting what we are aiming to do? And again, course correction being that really critical aspect of how this tool can be helpful. So now I'm going to ask Dana to join me in sharing some thoughts around the role that these dashboards can play in really creating a team effort. Dana?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Hilda. So I think as you're thinking about dashboards in particular, really want to hit on a few themes that Hilda had already mentioned. And again, this is a dashboard should be an extension of your planning process. And ideally, your planning process is something that is informed by multiple teams and multiple perspectives. So next slide, please. Yeah. As it relates to performance management, again, really critical to make sure that the right perspectives are at the table and that your planning in your budget to begin with, along with processes to monitor your performance against it, are inclusive of the right people at the table. So as for those of us who are lead finance members, our role is really sort of bringing all of this information in perspective and translating it in the form of numbers. But you want to make sure that, especially in the context of dashboarding, you're getting the perspectives across programs, across development, across human resources and operations, and you're getting the perspectives of the board in particular. And to Hilda's point around keeping stakeholders in mind, you're keeping the audiences and what they are most primed on and what they're focusing on and what questions they have in mind when you're building your dashboard. But you're also using a dashboard as an extension of your strategy development and really developing a unified vision of what we want to do and the key indicators that we think are going to get there. So really, I think where a lot of where dashboards fail is where it does seem like a more of a top-down directive, and it's something that's developed in silos. With an exercise like dashboarding, it becomes that much more critical to make sure that you have the right people at the table and to ensure some level of cross-functional representation, regardless of your budget size or your service or your industry area. Next slide. So I think as particularly for those of us who are finance and operations leads, when we think about dashboarding, it can be very easy to jump to questions around like what template should I use, what systems or platforms are the best ways to build a dashboard. How do I make my dashboard as pretty as possible? What should the graphs look like? And I think sometimes it's easier for us to lose that vision of how and why we want to use a dashboard and to fulfill its purpose. And I think where a lot of dashboards or dashboard exercises fail is that there isn't sufficient buy-in on what you're tracking and why, which is why that cross-functional input is so critical. So I think really ensuring that you're taking a step back and including the right perspectives in determining what are your key performance indicators. While you may not want a list of 50 indicators, because that sort of goes against the principle of this concept of focus that we want to build using a dashboard. You do want to make sure they are reasonably comprehensive and reflective of and directly connected to your strategic goals as an organization. So having a cross-functional input on not only choosing the key performance indicators, but what benchmarks are you using to measure and define success? And those can be from intermediaries or industry standards. They can be from peers, but being really intentional about formulating together what is success and how are we measuring and benchmarking it, and why are we using that benchmark, and involving the right people and perspectives into that process is really critical to reduce the prospect of a dashboard becoming a top-down exercise that really prevents opportunities for meaningful buy-in and leadership development and professional development across your team. I think a dashboard is also an important opportunity to outline and highlight who is responsible for certain components of your financial performance. So for program staff in particular, for those of you who have reimbursement-based contracts that are very directly tied to reaching certain programmatic outputs or serving a certain number of clients over a certain number of time to get reimbursements, it's really critical that program staff understand their level of ownership and agency over that process and over that indicator. So really using dashboards as an opportunity to build and to clarify those roles and responsibilities, I think, is a really important piece as it relates to utilizing dashboards for effective financial management. And I think dashboards, again, are a way of also promoting accessibility and access to information. So you want to build that inclusivity and participation that you're hopefully bringing into the development of the dashboards and the KPIs into the actual use of it and monitoring it over time. Make sure that people do have reasonable access and opportunity to see the data that's being tracked, and make room for regular conversation with multiple perspectives over the story that the dashboard is telling. And don't take for granted that everyone is going to have the same story or explanation for what those numbers are saying. You really want to leave room to poke holes and see and assess different perspectives about what the numbers are telling you. Next slide. So I think as it relates to dashboards, again, we talked about benchmarking and the importance of using dashboards as a tool for benchmarking and goal setting. But I think it's also really important to approach dashboarding with a level of openness. So knowing what assumptions you're trying to test, but also knowing that those assumptions may be proven true or not. So whether it's, if I have a certain number of program participants, it's going to, impact my revenue in X type of way. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But I think in line with leaving open conversations around the storytelling, really leaving room to not just clarify those assumptions, but to test them and to know, to Hilda's point, where some necessary course corrections might be necessary, and what it's going to entail to get there. So I think, again, it's really important to approach dashboarding with an appetite for experimentation and exploration, and leaving room for that, beyond just focusing on the platforms and the tools that you're using. And I think, to the extent possible, making sure you're holding on to and tracking data over time. So holding on to the data from, last year's dashboard, or last quarter's dashboard even, or last month's dashboard, really to help formulate and inform trends, which ideally are then used to inform strategy development and to help refine and adjust strategy where necessary. So leaving room and leaving a sufficient space, regardless of the tool that you're using, to make sure you are collecting data in aggregate over time to really understand what's happening both internally and externally within your organization. So with that, I will hand it over to our moderators, and it looks like we have the chat is now open, and see what questions are surfacing from our community.
Well, thank you, Dana. Thank you, Hilda. And hi, everyone. I'm Mark Hager. I'm one of the moderators for the nonprofit Financial Commons. And Wade Rogers and I are over in the chat. And there's been a dozen people that have jumped in there and either adding content or asking particular questions. I invite everyone to come over and post their comments and questions, because I have these couple of chances during the webinar to come in and ask some questions and chat a bit with our panelists. Hilda, I've got a question for you. It has to do with this issue of benchmarking. So you've described these KPIs, key performance indicators, as a output or an outcome measure that we illustrate, we put into our dashboards, and then we have information that we collect regularly that shows us where we're at on that particular outcome measure. And you showed us an example, and you referred to a traffic light. It was red, it was yellow, it was green. So my question is, how does one set these benchmarks? How does one know whether it's turning red or yellow or green? Yeah, I'll start there.
Love that question, and probably one of the hardest parts of building the dashboard, because that is what I would call a risk tolerance assessment. And so we have goals for certain outcomes, dollars or expense, whichever the measure is. And for some of us, if we're within 5%, we're good. Some of us who may be willing to take just a little bit more risk, we might say, well, as long as we're within 10%, we're good. And so the benchmarking of what indicates risk is really a decision to be made by that leadership team. And I think Dana talked about stakeholder engagement, bringing the stakeholders together, particularly those for whom the dashboard is intended, to say, well, what is your risk tolerance? When would you feel that we need to really sound the alarms, as well as when will we be so off that we are really in the red zone? So it's a very personal decision to the organization itself, but you know that if you go into yellow, behavior is going to start to change. It's like a warning sign. And if you go into red, for sure, behavior will respond to that.
So in some cases, a board or a staff may set their own goals in terms of where the green is versus the yellow versus the red. But we've heard some references to industry benchmarks, information coming from the broader industry or other nonprofit organizations. How can that industry information be helpful in setting these markers?
For industries that have available data, I would encourage you to have access to that or seek that out. And there are certain industries that have it. There's also peer benchmarking. And so if we, behind the concept of benchmarking is, who are you being compared to? And so thanks to available data from Candid, that is something that you can, if we want to see the 4 other organizations in our community that do exactly what we do, what is out there in terms of their ratios of revenue diversification or their ratios of salaries to total expenses. So there's the publicly available data. There is the industry available for those that have it. And then lastly, I would say lots of benchmarking happening, I feel, this year around equitable compensation. And so if you have access to peer information around compensation levels, sometimes you have to create the access by being willing to give your information to in return get those benchmarking reports.
Most of the examples so far seem to be about where an organization is in a KPI in a moment in time. Is it possible to illustrate change over time, year over year, and where organizations are on measures?
Absolutely. I think so. Change over time, whether it's year or quarter or day, depending on what you're measuring. There's the measure to goal, and then there's the composition. So we want foundation revenue to be 25% of this year's goal. So that's composition for the current period. And a dashboard could have all three, depending on what it is that your goal is. So if your goal is to increase reserves to 6 months of operations, showing the historical trend would be super helpful. Are we coming from having 1 month, or are we coming from having 9 months and we're now sort of decreasing? So that context is really important.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Hilda. Dana, there was a group of questions that came in before the webinar, and then also now coming up in the chat that have to do with the various stakeholders or audiences for these dashboards. One can see that a set of indicators would be useful for line staff to see. Maybe the same indicators, maybe different ones for executive staff. Maybe the same ones, different ones for the board. Maybe the same ones, different ones internally versus a public external facing audience. Is this one dashboard? Is this multiple dashboards? How do we think about these multiple audiences?
Yeah, and I think that can clearly, the answer to that question, I think, can obviously depend on the context and the organization and the realities that you're facing. But I think typically speaking, and speaking in a very general way, when you're speaking and engaging with program staff in particular around dashboards, very often that conversation almost has to be very much more drilled down and focused on the key activities that are very directly related to the work that staff is doing on the ground with the constituencies and communities that you're serving. So very often, and especially if you are using this as an opportunity for buy-in and build, because I'm seeing a lot of questions around that and ownership, you really need to make sure that the indicators are speaking directly to the activities that they are coming across and impacting every day, whether that's, number of children served through your daycare center, or number of meals distributed to the public. Whereas at the board level, especially at the overall board level, when you're lifting the information even beyond your treasurer, your finance committee, sometimes the information has to be on more of a macro level. So overall financial results, surplus deficit, access to cash and liquidity. And then based on conversations that are happening in the board level, you can drill down into the specific APIs that are most directly impacting those lagging indicators, to use Hilda's point. But from the perspective of buy-in and participation and using dashboards from that perspective, especially as it relates to your program and to your leadership team and your functional leads across development and HR, it does need to drill down to those activities that are most directly impacted by their roles and that they have the most direct responsibilities for. Whereas at the board level, it's very common to use a dashboard to highlight the overall story, and then to the extent that some of the more detailed KPIs are necessary in informing that story, providing some opportunity to double click on those as well. So again, it's really just paying attention to Hilda's point, what the audiences are, what they have ownership and direct responsibility for, and what they will have direct responsibility and opportunity to impact in a very explicit way.
Clearly there's some good internal, including the board, uses for these dashboards. Can they be used externally, public facing, or is that dangerous?
That's a great question, and I invite Hilda's perspective on this as well. The context I think would matter, but I do think for organizations that are making very bold claims for who they want to be and what they want to represent in their communities, I think it could be an important opportunity for transparency, right? And I think it really, integrity towards the communities that you serve. I think from the perspective of risk tolerance, that's an area, especially where an organization would really need to take a step back and sort of think about who they are and what is being communicated into the communities and constituents that you serve, to make sure that you're living up to that. But in terms of the specific data that you would want to share, obviously that's a question to the organization of like, to what end are we doing this, and being really clear and honest and pragmatic about what the potential risk could be. But I would never downplay the opportunity for it to be a powerful moment and opportunity to relay and be an example of transparency and accountability either.
Yeah.
I would agree. And also if you feel that the community is part of the strategy. So for example, an organization that is working on creating a fund for the future, and they are looking to raise $1 million over the next 2 years, having a dashboard that shows progress towards goal is a great tool to engage those very stakeholders that we hope will contribute to that particular campaign.
All right. Well, thanks to both. I'll return over to the chat and see what emerges there for our next segment. Hilda, I think we hand off to you so we can start talking to some of our practitioners who are actually using these dashboards in their organizations.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'd like to just have the 4 of us just be on video quickly, just to remind you all about who our guests are. So we have Dawn and Kim who have joined us, and we're going to begin with my having a conversation with Kim about her experiences as the CFO of the Oakland Museum of California, and how the role of the dashboard has really helped her in her role as CFO. So Kim, why don't you tell us a little bit about the organization and your role within the museum?
Will do. Thanks, Hilda. It's great to be with you all today. Oakland Museum of California, which we lovingly call OMCA, is a leading cultural institution of the Bay Area of California and a resource for the research and understanding of California's dynamic culture and environmental heritage for visitors from the region, the state, and around the world. We strive to inspire Californians to create a more vibrant future for themselves and their communities by exploring the big ideas that shape California lives, and then bringing to life the untold and undertold stories of the people behind them. At OMCA, we have more than 1.9 million objects in our multidisciplinary collections of history, art, and natural science, all within our 110,000 square feet of gallery space and 7-acre campus. We like to say we're more than a museum. We're a museum, garden, and gathering place. In terms of size, so you can get some perspective, OMCA has about 115 employees and a budget size of 17 million, and we have a donor-driven business model. I've been CFO here at OMCA for the past nearly 6 years. And before that, I was CFO for 10 years at a performing arts organization in San Francisco.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that. Tell us a little bit about how you use dashboards for decision making. Who is the audience? How do you engage with them on these with these dashboards?
Yeah, the dashboard that we use here at OMCA actively is used as a management tool. We don't present it to the board. We don't present it externally. And the dashboard itself is not ever used in isolation. It is always part of a discussion. It's a discussion tool in a monthly meeting that includes the people who have direct leadership and responsibility over those metrics being monitored. The group having the conversation is our influencers, if you will. The particular dashboard we're sharing with you today is used to measure progress towards the goal of maintaining budget outcomes across the organization. This kind of dashboard can be used, it's best used to measure momentum and movement towards a goal. It's never static. It doesn't necessarily track against industry benchmarks unless that's a goal you're trying to move towards, because it does track progress towards specific goals or objectives, whatever form that goal or objective might take. It can use qualitative data in what we call milestones just as easily as it can use quantitative data in what we call plans and actuals. It is critical to the use of this particular type of dashboard to have a metric for each month that tracks the cumulative progress towards a goal or something that the organization wants to change. This particular dashboard format is really good for monitoring progress around change and for testing assumptions underlying the desired change.
And so I've heard you talk about rules of engagement with the dashboard and the discussions that you have in your meetings. What are those rules of engagement?
Yeah, so you can see this is a pretty busy dashboard. There's a lot of data on it. The first rule is we don't ever talk about the greens. If they're doing well, they don't need to be talked about. We focus on the reds and the yellows because those are the areas that have deviated from the goals. And when we talk about those reds and yellows, we're looking for the root cause and actionable steps. We really, really focus on digging down to the root cause. Setting the goal too high is not a root cause, for example, but not having enough staff to get to the goal that was set could be a root cause. We use the practice of asking 5 whys, which you may be familiar with, to get to that root cause. When we're engaging with managers around the table, everybody is hearing everyone else's root causes. Everybody is available to ask questions. Everybody is encouraged to be curious. To make this work, the owner of the metric really needs, and everyone really needs to park egos at the door. We want to know what's going amiss with the target so that the organization can rally together and make good decisions as part of the entire ecosystem. So it isn't about one metric failing or one person not succeeding. It's about the entire organization being at its best collectively. This is really hard for some managers at first, but it becomes easier, and then it actually becomes liberating to be working as a collective towards organizational success. So the managers around the table become a web of support for each other, moving away from individual success or failure at the cost of something else in the organization.
And Kim, Mark asked the question about the red, yellow, green. I wondered if you could share a little bit more about how you came up with the ranges as they are. And I see you have them spelled out at the top of the dashboard here.
Yeah, these are the ones that work for us. They have seemed to be the points at which a initiative needs to be talked about, is starting to need to be talked about in the yellow or red, but your organization could set them wherever you think you're going to generate the best conversation at the right point of intervention.
And so can you just say a little bit more about how you think about whether it's red, yellow, or green? Is it across all the areas, or is it unique? Certain areas we have these measures, other areas we have different ones.
Yeah, each goal and objective that we're tracking has its own measure. And so it's going to be red, yellow, or green by itself. So we start off, as you can see here, with a plan. The plan is what we plan to do across the way. That can change, right? So you'll see that we also have a place for forecast. That helps us to say, okay, the plan isn't working anymore. What are we going to forecast against? So once we start tracking against a forecast, we stop tracking against the plan or the budget. And again, we can track the milestones here too. If there are qualitative goals towards meeting an outcome, those can be tracked as red, yellow, green as well, just deciding on what criteria organizationally turns that red, yellow, or green.
Kim, you talked about a sort of a team of collective support and sort of thinking about the bigger picture. Can you share with us just an example of that? I think that's everyone's dream in terms of stakeholder engagement.
Yeah, so when we're talking about root causes and drilling down, there are some things, and the questions are listed here about what can the discussion can happen around there. So some of the key options to get something back on target, a yellow or a red back to green, that is the goal. Everything its goal is to get to green. We could add more resources. We could shift the objective we're measuring. We could come up with a new measurement. Or we could acknowledge that the strategy just isn't working and stop it and put those resources elsewhere in the organization where they'll have more return.
And so can you say a little bit more about an example of how you might do that?
Yes. So this is an example of our school group revenue and how we were tracking it. It's the top metric there, and you can see that it was red for quite a while. Independent of our monthly dashboard meeting review cycle, we were seeing, starting to hear in the organization a lot of tension around school groups. Starting to hear that school groups weren't being supported, that we needed more security guards, we needed more volunteers, that school groups were really starting to kind of make tension in the organization around the resources they needed to get their job done. So we started, again, as we looked at this dashboard, knowing that they weren't meeting their revenue goals, we started to drill down into root causes. In this particular case, it was, and I said this wasn't necessarily excuse earlier, but it was that their metric was just set too high. And the reason we were able to bring it down, so you'll see that in this example, I believe it's in December, we started tracking against a new set of metrics. So grayed out the plan and started the forecast. We realized that because of the metric below it was so far over budget, we could shift resources. We could say to the school groups, we can bring your revenue goal down because that's what was driving the tension. And once we saw that we could balance out our non-performing metric versus an over-performing metric across the organization, even though they weren't in the same departments at all, tension just came out of the organization. There was no more call for more resources. There was no more pressure on different departments and finger pointing. We really drilled down to the root cause of all this tension in the organization was the revenue goal. And we didn't have to have it as high as we did.
And the fact that you had the opportunity to have a different revenue source that could compensate, I think is a great example of how we're all one organization and sometimes one department is doing better and sometimes another. Is there anything else you would add about sort of the decision-making ability that you find you have now with the dashboard, or decisions that you are making that you couldn't even imagine how they would be possible without it?
I think the power of this kind of dashboard, as you just said, is really working the metrics as a collective group. No one person is out on their own driving a metric in isolation from the rest of the organization. It really helps as well to have managers understanding what other managers are going through. So it's creating a collective, a web of support that I think that's really the power of this dashboard. It's in the conversation about the metrics, not necessarily in the metrics itself.
And I imagine a meeting where the various managers are together so that they're able to
Absolutely
have the conversation. Wonderful.
Yeah, so
and that's,
every month, yeah, every month, every manager who has a dashboard, who has a metric on the dashboard is present in a room together, and we go through it, the whole dashboard, only talking about reds and yellows until we're done.
Wonderful. And I think earlier we talked about dashboards being for different stakeholders. And so you described this one as very much in support of management and their collective decision and their collective performance. There may be others where you're sort of reporting on that performance to board or external, but this is their moment to come together. Thank you so much, Kim. I really appreciate these thoughts. And I am going to now ask Dana to lead our conversation with Dawn.
Thanks so much, Hilda, and thank you, Kim, for sharing your story. I am very excited, honored, and privileged to have the opportunity to hear from Dawn Bentley, who again is the executive director of the Minnesota Fringe Festival. So Dawn, we're really eager to hear about your dashboard story, but before we do, would you mind telling us a little bit more about your role and a little bit more about Minnesota Fringe Festival?
Sure. So thanks for having me. Again, my name is Dawn Bentley, Executive Director of the Minnesota Fringe Festival. We are a part of a fringe movement that started in 1947 in Edinburgh, Scotland, and now there are more than 250 fringe festivals around the world. We are affiliated and friendly with one another, but we're all independently run, mostly as nonprofits, especially here in North America, of which we are one of the top 5 fringes in North America, the largest in the Midwest for certain. And we've been going now for 30 years. We just finished our 30th festival here in Minneapolis. We had more than 20,000 seats filled in 11 days. And typically we have more than 525 performances, over 100 productions. We use small theaters all around town. And we have about a $1.9 million economic impact on our city in just those 2 weeks alone. I've been here for 7 years. Prior to this, I was the executive director of another festival called Art Shanty Projects, which is an art installation that takes place on the surface of a frozen lake, so only here in Minnesota. And then I also worked for another festival called Northern Spark, which was a dusk till dawn all night festival that happened here in Minneapolis as well. So I love the festival world. And I love the arts, and that is why I'm choosing to lead this wonderful organization that supports artists on every aspect of their artistic journey.
Fantastic, love it. So tell us a little bit more about your dashboard journey, particularly how did you come to the decision that you needed or wanted a dashboard, and really how did it come about?
Sure. When I started 7 years ago, there was an upheaval in management and boards. We had a lot of new people in the organization, a lot of new people in the governance aspect, and some of them were artists, which we love. Some artists are not comfortable with numbers. And because there was so much new blood in the organization, nobody really knew if we knew ourselves well enough to be stable, and there had been cash flow problems. So we decided to create a dashboard so that anyone in the organization could look at our cash flow, understand our business cycle, which when you're running a festival, it is a year-long business cycle. You don't get to, have a play and then 6 weeks later have a different play and try a different marketing strategy and see if that works. I set the dials in December and I have to wait until August to see if it has worked. And then conversely, half of our income comes from the festival itself. So we have very restricted cash flow at certain times throughout the year. So getting everybody to understand our business model, understand our business cycle, and understand our cash flow issues was very important for stabilizing the organization. And from there, things just kind of grew. We ended up adding a lot more KPIs, the obvious select revenue, select expense accounts, but also KPIs around development, around board building, and an audience management, until we've got this level of KPIs and visuals on our dashboard, which we'll show shortly, that everyone feels comfortable with, but it is a dynamic beast. So our new fiscal year is about to start, and we'll probably add some and drop some, but we always have the previous versions to look at.
And so before we take a look at the dashboard, given that, using your own language, it is a dynamic beast, have there been any thoughts going into this next fiscal year about how you would want to revisit it or revamp it or change it in terms of what you're tracking and how you're tracking the information in it?
Yeah, well, yes. So every year we kind of have a focus. What are we focusing on? Is it growing audience? Is it social media? And we have a series of board members that are going to roll off because they've termed out of our organization. And so we're really focusing on board recruiting. So I'm sure that's going to be added to the dashboard. It'll be, asks, interviews, and selections. And then we're also really focusing on our social media. We're going to hire new social media managers. So we'll probably work with that person about getting good metrics, what to look at, whether it's additional followers or engagement. I'm going to let the expert tell me what should be on the dashboard.
So this might be a good chance for us to actually, take a look at a sample of your dashboard. So it was really helpful to understand the context in which this came about. Heard a lot of emphasis on having new board, new management, not all having the same understanding or even language around the number. So in that context, especially, can certainly understand why dashboard is a critical tool. But can you expand a little bit more, Dawn, on the extent to which this dashboard has been useful in informing decisions and strategies for the Fringe Festival?
Yeah, a couple of things. An engaged board member is an active, board member, and a board member that is going to want to really help further the organization. So I wanted to engage board members who maybe wouldn't want to look at a P&L and ask any questions about that, to ask questions about our projected and income and actual income, so that I felt that they understood the business cycle. So on this dashboard, we have the projected income and expense. And theoretically, if we know ourselves, then our actual income and expense will just lie right on top of it. And when it doesn't, we just don't go on with the conversation until somebody asks why. Why is the dotted line and the solid line, why are they not aligned? And then we can have a conversation about what happened. And that's also similar with the cash actual versus ending cash balance. How is it? And it doesn't matter if it's more cash or less cash. Like, let's just talk about what's going on right now. Are there special projects? Did something happen that we didn't expect? So in that way, I've really engaged all board members, no matter what their comfort level is with numbers, to have conversation and be in conversation and be active and aware of what's going on in the organization. Other things, like we took on a new person was writing grants this year. And so we really needed to look at those leading and lagging indicators of grant writing. And I never want a board member to say, well, can't we just write a grant for that? Because we all know, those of us who do write grants, that it sometimes takes 3 times as many submissions to receive, to win the grants that you want. So we have been really focused this year on upping the number of grants that we're applying to, because we're looking at changing what I call our mixed change of revenue. And so submitting for more grants, and then obtaining our grant goal in terms of number and, of course, of dollar. And then with these boards that were relatively new, we've had a few new people in the last year. So we implemented the board buddy system. And we had historically board members who maybe would put in their pledge form, but would not make their contribution, or maybe not even get all the pledge forms, which is really important. So putting board metrics on there started in this past year. And if my board buddy leaders see a red line, like, oh, we only have 36% of our board donations are in, and the cutoff is usually July 1st, then maybe we need to make some phone calls and just be like, hey, buddy, just wanted to make sure that you are still on board, or if you need to change the date, let me know, or just communicate in a peer-to-peer level, so that nobody is outed or shamed in a public arena at a board meeting.
So yeah, I definitely am hearing that this emphasis on board engagement and also sort of seeing how, to your point around your revenue mix, half of it is the festival, but obviously there's other sources that comprise that other half. And fundraising is a huge part of that. Can totally see how what you're looking at here in terms of the indicators that you've chosen helps you directly see that the leading actions that you need to take to get to some of those lagging goals. I think one of the other indicators that I was particularly interested in, and it's in that lower right-hand corner, it's the festival applications. And so if I'm reading this correctly, the goal for the year was 300, and it looks like you actually got, far more than that, about 515. And again, without knowing context or history or what's the normal number, would love to hear, one, your reflections on that, and two, given that you've significantly outpaced your goal, how has that made you think differently about the festival, how has those results informed any type of strategic thinking around the festival going forward?
Thanks. That's a great question, because it really made a difference. So while there isn't industry standards for fringe festivals, when I talk to other fringe leaders around the world, typically you would want to get 3 times as many applications as you have festival slots for. So we had about 100 slots in our festival. So we were hoping that we get 300 applications. And the fact that we got 515 was a strong indicator to me that artists are ready to come back to perform. It is different than last year when we only made our goal. So it tells me a couple of things. Our festival is a desirable festival for people to apply to, and that artists are ready to get back on stage. And all of my other research that I've looked into, artists are the leading indicator when it comes to performing arts, and the audience is the lagging indicator. You can't get the audience to come if the artists aren't ready to be on stage. So I was very excited to see this number of applications, but we have to drill into that number a little bit, because we have 4 different tiers of applications based on the size of the theater. So a large 500-seat theater, you can apply to that. Or if you're a newer artist, because we work with artists across the entire spectrum, you can apply for a small 75-seat theater. So it's not just the number that says, hurrah, artists are here. It is which tiers are they applying to? And so when we drill into that number, we see there's a lot more artists going for the smaller venues. They're ready to come back, but they're not quite ready to go into a great big house. So it's impacted our decision for next year's festival to change the venues that we're going to include more smaller houses, so that we can get these artists who are really interested in getting on stage, and the audiences that will follow them onto the stages that are available.
Yeah, and I think, especially given the events of the past 2 years, really paying attention to the dynamics and the environment as it relates to both artists and audiences, which you mentioned is a key, lagging indicator. I think many arts organizations are really keen on and paying attention to right now. And to that end, I think one of the indicators that I'm seeing, sort of reflective of audience response or audience participation, is box office sales in that upper right-hand corner. So in some of my comments, I had used ticket sales as something, that you could, potentially is an area where you may want to test assumptions, whether it's, having this number of seats is going to, guarantee this level of revenue, or having prices at this level will help enforce or guarantee this level of revenue. How have you been thinking about, I guess, box office and ticket sales, and how has this dashboard, helped inform that thinking?
So historically, if you look at 10 years of data at our festival, about 1/3 of the tickets were bought in advance, and 2/3 were bought at the box office. Fringe festivals are a unique beast, where you can literally go to 5 or 7 shows in one day, because they're only an hour long and there's 30 minutes in between. So I was trying to drive more sales to pre-sales. And so we did a price differential to see if that would work. And those pre-sales typically happen in July, and our festival happens the first 13 days of August. It made no difference when I lowered the price for pre-sales. And so I think that the way our audience operates, they just want to live in the spontaneity and the excitement of being in the moment and deciding in the moment, I'm just going to go to this show. And so I think that's going to probably change my mind next year and say it doesn't matter if you pre-sale or buy at the box office, it's just going to be the same price, because there was no driver in my July and August versions of this that demonstrated any difference in pre-sales over the past year as far as a percentage of total sales.
But again, I'm glad that this was an opportunity for you to test that assumption around pre-sales and then to course correct and navigate accordingly. I would love to continue this one-on-one conversation, but also want to open it up to our participants and leave some room to hear some questions and reactions from our audience. So with that, I'll hand it over to our moderators.
Thank you, Dana. And we're getting everybody back on here. Don, Kim, I guess, coming back on as well. Great, thank you. Hello, everybody. Again, I'm Mark Hager, one of the moderators of the Nonprofit Financial Commons. Some great questions coming in over at the chat, and some great questions came in before the webinar. Some of you may have seen in our forums for the Nonprofit Financial Commons, I have posted my summary of some of the big questions that came in before the webinar came in. Go take a look there and post, if you will, because we're not going to be able to get to everything. For example, Monique posted in the chat a little bit ago, what about, are we going to see examples of some non-financial kinds of indicators? And we're just not going to have enough time to go through that. There are lots of potential for what can go into a dashboard. Marketing indicators, programmatic indicators, advocacy indicators that go beyond the financial ones that we have been able to emphasize in these two examples here. Go over to the forums, check out our resource page, and there's a lot more to say beyond what we can do in our hour and a half here today. Thanks again to Kim and to Dawn for their examples here. I've got about 10, 12, 14 minutes, it looks like, to chat with you on some questions. My first is a very practical one that a lot of people asked about, but we didn't really get a good sense of so far in the presentations. It's the, what software do we use? What tools are available in order to craft these things? If somebody's building from scratch, what do you use? For example, I'm an Excel guy. I would probably build this from Excel, but there's a lot of other tools that could be used. Dawn and Kim, what do you use? What have you seen used? And Hilda and Dana, you may have thoughts about what's possible here as well. Dawn, what do you have to say?
So I use Google Sheets, and that's primarily because this is a living document that my board members can look at any time. And so having that updated in real time, and then they can look at it, and if they are so inclined. So we just use Google Sheets, and I do download out of QuickBooks Desktop. I also teach nonprofit financial management, and as a final project, all my students have to make a dashboard. And so I've seen people use Word and Excel and Access and make some really beautiful dashboards. And so I love that they get to be creative in whatever way that works for them.
Yeah.
Very similar answer. So the dashboard that I shared started out in Excel, but like Dawn, we moved it to Google Sheets so that we could share it. So every person in the organization who has responsibility for a metric or a budget has access to it at any point in time. We've written reports in our various systems in a format that we can just download them, copy and paste them over into some back sheets on the dashboard, and then they go off and populate. And the red, yellow, green coding and metrics is also just automatically populating based on some conditional formatting.
Yeah, thank you. Google Sheets sounds popular then. Dana, Hilda, anything to add on this question?
Yeah, I think I know there's probably softwares and pretty cost-intensive softwares like Tableau that organizations should consider. QuickBooks to some extent has some level of dashboard capabilities, but I think whether it's Google Sheets or an Excel, the ability to build and navigate is usually in a very cost-effective way is usually pretty sufficient. Again, it's, I think, thinking about who on your team is going to be responsible for uploading the data, I think is a really big consideration, whether it's you as the finance lead or other people, because you want it to be as much of a user-friendly exercise, and especially when different people are entering data at different times, making sure that it's accessible and that you're using, especially if it's sheets or some form of Excel on SharePoint or OneDrive. So make sure that it is shared and people have access to it is helpful. But I typically find that Excel, whether it's a red, yellow, green framework or one that includes graphs or charts, gives you the ability to easily create the pictorial element while also giving a very clear inputs and instruction for where and how the data will be entered. So if you have the abilities and the appetite for the more sophisticated systems, absolutely go for it. More power to you, but never underestimating what you can accomplish through Excel and Google Sheets is something I would certainly emphasize.
Yeah, I think part of the importance of the dashboard is that you may need to bring indicators from different sources, some from the development system, some from the program side, some from the finance, and it's sometimes difficult for ERP systems to be able to allow that. So the flexibility that you've described is really valuable. Then, of course, we have our sponsor for today that I'm sure has lots of functionality in the dashboard space.
Thank you all. The next question is about making choices about what to present in a dashboard. There's going to be a class of folks, many of whom are probably listening in right now, that see a dashboard of quantitative information as the best thing they've ever seen in their lives. But we're going to have staff members, board members, other stakeholders whose brains will just shut down when it comes to looking at any level of quantitative information here. How do we balance? How do we make decisions about putting reasonable amount of information in front of people that isn't overwhelming?
Anybody? Anybody want to jump on that one?
Let me ask this, Dawn, do people find it overwhelming, or does everybody love your dashboard?
I think people focus on the part of the dashboard that is most meaningful to them. And it's all on one page. But that my finance committee is very concerned about our select revenue and expense accounts. My governance committee is very concerned about how the board is doing. Are the board fulfilling the promises? The development committee is very concerned about how we're doing with this changing our mixed change of revenue with adding more grants. They focus on that. We try to just see if anyone in any committee has something to say. And if ever the lines aren't right on top of one another, we definitely need to have a conversation about why, even if it's good news. Hey, good news. We just inherited a program from another nonprofit that shut down. We got an influx of cash and now we can serve artists better. Good news. So yeah, I think people just focus on the part that's important to them. And every year at the beginning of the fiscal year, we just reassess, like, what is our focus this year?
Don, somebody asked in the chat when you had your dashboard put up there, your dashboard was a mix of some pretty charts, like some people are really going to like to see, but then all of the data in rows and columns around it. The question was, do you show all of that when you're showing that to staff and board, or are you just showing the resulting charts?
I show the whole thing. Everything you see is what they see. It gets pulled out of another spreadsheet, which is just a dump out of my QuickBooks, but it's updated that way, and then they just see it, the whole thing. So if they want to know, okay, these lines don't match up by how much, they can actually look at the real numbers too, and we can talk about that. Oh, that $20,000 difference is that $20,000 grant we didn't think we would get.
Okay, good. Kim, worried about overwhelming your audiences, or do you think you strike a good balance?
I think with our dashboard, no project or budget manager has more than 1 or 2 metrics on the dashboard. Remember that ours is really about measuring progress towards a strategic change. And we break that down into a bunch of different projects across the organization. So it's not overwhelming to our participants because they only hold a couple of metrics on there, and they're only responsible for brainstorming with the group about root causes for their metrics. Everybody else they're curious, right? If their metric is green, it's an opportunity for them to ask some questions about why yellow and red metrics aren't working that might help the project manager get unstuck. So really, I don't feel that this is overwhelming just because each person has something that they're individually responsible for.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, Hilda, Dana, any thoughts on best practices on making these as absorbable as possible? Hilda?
I wanted to add the concept of if you place it on, you share your screen in a virtual meeting or you just hand it to someone, that may feel overwhelming, but once you start to walk people through the individual components the first time, they become familiar. Part of the goal is that the dashboard doesn't change on a monthly basis. So you get used to what the picture is telling you over time. And you, as a reader, you almost build their muscle to being able to absorb it all. So not in isolation, and some are accompanied by memo for those who feel more comfortable with words rather than pictures. That's another way to make them more accessible. Dana, anything else you'd add?
Yeah, I was you use the word can helping staff get unstuck, and I've been, to the extent that I can, monitoring the chat, and there's a lot of fear around how dashboards can and often are used as punitive measure, this fear of it being a report card. And I think, again, you just presented an excellent example of like, let's use this dashboard to help each other. So to the extent that anyone anyone here has additional thoughts around that as well, because I think that can also factor into making the dashboard feel less overwhelming, not just the volume of it, but how it's being used. So anything either of you can share around how to make it less of a punitive exercise and more of an opportunity for support and innovation, I think would be really helpful to hear as well.
I definitely want to echo Hilda that there's a learning curve every time I introduce this dashboard to a new set of people. It is there's a pattern. When people see it and they see the reds, they tense up and they get nervous and they feel like it's punitive. And part of my job as walking them through the process of using this dashboard is to constantly remind them the metric is red, not you. It's the metric that we're trying to change. So I will say, for at least the first 3 months that we're using it, as we are establishing, as Hilda said, establishing a culture around how we're going to use this information, I always say park your egos at the door. It's not about you, it's about the whole organization. How are we going to balance resources to achieve the goals that we've set out to achieve? Sometimes that means we will stick with the goals we're going to achieve and achieve it on a different path than we thought. And sometimes the goal we thought we were going to achieve isn't actually as important as we thought it was. So the use of the dashboard that we use at Oakland Museum of California really is a culture of liberation and support.
I think that we use the term, our budget is our moral promise to the people that we serve all the time. And our budgeting process is rather long. It's about 3-4 months long, and we only have 2 full-time employees. And then I work with the finance committee on it. But it is very much like our moral promise. What are we promising to focus on? Who are we promising to help? And how are we going to do that? And so before we even start laying down the numbers, which end up translating into our projected income and expense, We talk about what are our priorities and our values and what do we want to make sure happens to support the people that we came to support. And then we just use that budget to solidify our moral promise. So there's a story in there that has more to do with our values and our service than it has to do with just some numbers.
And
One
Mark,
last question from me. We got a couple of minutes left here. Kim, Dawn, can you talk a little bit about your experience in populating the data in your dashboards? Are there pitfalls that you have in gathering the information and making sure it's current for your various audiences? Kim?
I work with the project or the budget managers to identify metrics that make sense to them. And we are very clear to make sure whether it's a leading or a lagging, and we know what we're measuring. And we always look to things that are easy to measure. If you can't measure it, it's not going to help you tell the story of how your project or your budget item is proceeding towards its goal. Other than that, as I said, we've been able to write some reports in our other systems that just kind of make the download of data and then the calculation of them automatic. But I'm not establishing the metrics on my type of dashboard. The managers who are responsible for it are, with my advice and lived experience about what works and what doesn't work.
Dawn?
Well, in a shop with only 2 people, year round, I do all of the data dumping, but it's pretty simple. And I've written a couple of scripts so that once I download out of QuickBooks, I can just throw it into my Google Sheet and then everything populates itself.
Okay, thank you. Hilda, I'll return to you. You look like you might have had a thought on these questions, but otherwise, I think I go off screen and we go into wrapping up our webinar. Hilda?
I just wanted to emphasize something Kim said, which was plans change. And so the original budget may be revisited during the year in some cases, and we have either a revised budget or a forecast that we start to measure against. We want to remember that with the dashboards as well. We want to be managing against reality and not an original plan that is no longer the plan that we're carrying out. And so just again, to wrap up our time together, we have covered our Q&A in terms of resources. Keep in mind that this is one component of the program. For Financial Commons, we're here together. You'll be able to download a recording if there are others that weren't here that you'd like to share this with. But then there are the resources where you can download associated with today's program. Some of the things I referred to in terms of the cheat sheet and other things will be available as part of those resources. And this is about connection. So please stay connected. The forums, as we have here, await. If you have colleagues who aren't here with us today that you think could benefit from joining, that would be wonderful. And remember that each of these sessions is treated as a course. When you go on the website, you will have all the materials curated for you for sharing or for reference at any point in the future. And as we always like to do at the end of these programs, we would love to know, what would you like to learn more about with respect to nonprofit finance? And so we leave this chat open for you all to let us know what other topics, what other areas you would like to learn more about. And we want to thank all of you who have been part of the program. It was great to see. We have over 100 entries in the chat, which is really indicative of great engagement from all of you today. I want to thank my co-panelists for being here with us today, and wish you all a wonderful rest of your day and rest of your week, and enjoy the fall. Thank you, everyone.